Earlier today, we talked about another kind of inclusion, right? A sort of ideological divide that we need to cross. So I would like to tell you that I mentioned Bob Inglis was going to be with us today, and unfortunately, thanks to our airline industry, he's not, but he is because it's virtual. And so where's Vidya? Is Vidya here? Where? Vidya. All right, Vidya is going to have this amazing conversation with Bob, and I think we're going to learn a lot about how we can tell stories that cross divides and how we can learn from one another. So Vidya, it's all yours.
All right, sounds good. So, hey Bob, thanks for joining us from not DC, unfortunately. It'd be wonderful to have you back again, but I'm so excited to be having this conversation because Bob is bringing a really not often heard perspective in the climate movement, probably from the people that we might need to compel the most in the United States. And we need to talk about these sustainable solutions with the people that matter. So Bob, tell us about what you do. You helped found Republic EN, engaging Republicans and conservatives on climate, or what you call the eco-right. So what is Republic EN, the eco-right, and what do you do?
Yeah, well, great to be with you, and wish it were in person, but this will do, I suppose. So RepublicEN.org is a group of conservatives who care about climate change, and so EN for energy, entrepreneurship, the environment. And what we do is go to fellow conservatives with credible messengers, people who know the language of the tribe, and affirm the truth that free enterprise can solve climate change. So that's our thing, RepublicEN.org.
Yeah, thanks for that. So you have a very interesting climate origin story, actually. So you served on the Hill here in DC for 10 years representing South Carolina before going on and founding Republic EN, but you weren't always into climate. And in the movement, we have these, we call the world at a point of inflection. So, I'm curious, what was your inflection point? When did you become a climate Republican, and what does that mean?
Well, yeah, for my first 6 years in Congress, I said that climate change was nonsense. I didn't know anything about it except that Al Gore was for it. Okay, I admit that's pretty ignorant, but that's the way it was my first 6 years in Congress. And I really fit the district, Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina, a very conservative district. That was my first 6 years. Then I was out of Congress for 6 years doing commercial real estate law again in Greenville, South Carolina. Had the opportunity to run for the same seat again in 2004. That's the year that our son, the eldest of our 5 kids, had just turned 18, so he's voting for the first time. And he came to me and said, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." His 4 sisters agreed, his mother agreed. New constituency, So that was step 1 of a 3-step metamorphosis. Step 2 was going to Antarctica and seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings with the science committee. And then step 3 was another science committee trip and something of a spiritual awakening, really, at the Great Barrier Reef, snorkeling with an Aussie climate scientist who I could see, without any words being spoken, I could see that he was worshiping God in what he was showing me. And so, St. Francis of Assisi supposedly said, I don't know if he actually said it, but supposedly he said, "Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words." And so this Aussie climate scientist, Scott Heron, who's now become a very dear friend, was doing just that. And so later we had a chance to talk, and he told me about conservation changes he was making in his life to love God and love people. Rides his bike to work, does without air conditioning in Townsville, Australia, as much as possible. It's a pretty hot place. Hangs family's clothes out on the line, all to consciously love people coming after us. So I got right inspired. I wanted to be like Scott, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. Probably not the best political timing to introduce a carbon tax in the midst of the Great Recession when you represent maybe the reddest district in the reddest state of the nation. Didn't go well. I got tossed out of Congress in 2010 in a Republican primary. And ever since then, I've been doing this thing, republician.org. It's different names before, but now it's republician.org, a growing group of conservatives who care about climate change.
So Bob, how are you getting these conservatives on board? Is it like the same three-part agenda of like, talking to your son and then going to Antarctica and then snorkeling? Or like, how are you having these conversations with, other Republicans on the Hill, people you may have known before, and also just constituents in your district, red state, red constituency, how's it going?
Well, it's going a lot better than it used to. When I was getting tossed out of Congress, it was like this, I don't believe in climate change and you shouldn't either. It's sort of active and aggressive disbelief of climate change. Now, people aren't arguing so much with thermometers and yardsticks and rulers about sea level rise, but they are sort of stuck on the question, how do you get the world in on this? And so what we do is we help answer that question and talk about, in that case, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which we think is the momentum maker of this year and next. It's going to be the thing that maybe causes members of Congress to wake up to the reality that the European Union is going to start collecting a tax on our stuff that we ship to them that we could collect ourselves. And it makes no difference to our companies, no difference to their customers. So who would you rather have the money, the European Union or America? And then when they start figuring that out, they'll say, you know what? We could do that to China as well. We could make them pay our carbon tax unless they had their own. So we really think that's going to be the thing that changes it. But it really has changed quite a bit. Since, in a way, I was the worst commercial for this. English, don't let your shadow fall on me, But now it's changed. I think members of Congress on the right are looking for some action here, or some way to explain it to their constituents.
So you mentioned tax, which is like the third rail for Republicans here in DC. So I'm wondering if this strategy works as well when you're going back and talking to your constituents. What are the narratives that are really bringing people forward, that are causing them to change? Like for you, it was these three steps, but for people on the ground who are experiencing impacts that they might not realize is climate change, what's causing them to flip that switch in their brain, recognizing what they're looking around at them, seeing the environment changing, the people changing, their communities changing? When you go back to your people, what does that conversation look like for you?
Well, I think not everybody's going to be able to do what I did. I was surrounded by this community of loving support, my kids, my wife, my friend Scott, people that matter to me. And my faith gives me quite a reservoir of grace to draw on. So I was able to say, listen, sorry, I was just wrong before, and move on. But I think that most people, I don't know, a lot of people won't be able to have that. I'm not sure it's most, but many people won't have that. And so what we can do for them, though, is say, yeah, I see you didn't like the solution we were talking about before. You didn't like a regulatory solution. You didn't necessarily like those incentives, but how about a simple accountability message? Does that fit with your conservative values? And so that's usually where we can start the conversation, but the key really is to listen to them and to find out where the objection is coming from. And the pretty exciting thing is that just about every objection can be met. They're really, you just got to listen carefully to what it is they're saying, because a lot of it is they don't think they got a solution that fits with their values. And that's what they need to hear from people who like them and may, in fact, be like them. Then they can start hearing that, hey, you know what, we do have a solution, don't we? And of course, it might surprise them eventually to find out that it's the same solution that a lot of progressives would actually embrace.
Yeah, so on that note, you mentioned the fear and anxiety of coming out as a conservative and having your community, vindicate you. And, you were talking climate as a Republican back in like the earlier 2000s, so that's even rougher than it is now. So I want to ask you, what suggestions do you have for people who want to bring conservatives in and help them overcome this anxiety of, being put out there? Your head's on a chopping block and you're like, why would I want to do that? So how do you take a step out in that community, put yourself out there and join the movement, the climate movement, which has like a burgeoning eco-right, as you've called it?
Yeah, it is, eco-right is our term to balance the environmental left. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent annually each year, hundreds of millions on the environmental left. Teeny weeny bit on the eco-right. It's understandable why the bird can't fly straight. But we're trying to grow the eco-right. And I think the key thing is to make sure to say to conservatives, oh no, we're not canceling you. We're not going to get rid of you. You're not a barnacle on the ship of state that we want to rub off. We need you. We need everybody in order to solve this. So the best thing that actually progressives can do, I think, is just open up the conversation and welcome conservatives and try to give them a little bit of grace about maybe they didn't like the solution. There is sort of an obvious problem with the regulatory solution, and that is you can regulate here, but if you can't regulate in China, manufacturers may pick up and move from here to there, and they emit more when they get there than they were emitting here. So you just went downhill on climate change. So understanding that weakness of that approach, it maybe comes naturally to people who believe in the efficacy of government. Maybe then there can be a little bit of humility about, hey, what do you think would work? Say that to conservatives. And then once that happens, I think the conversation can turn to a more productive strain. Okay, that may be dreaming, but I'm not the only one. There's a song about that,
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So we have a couple of minutes left. I want to get through a last couple of questions. The first being, what does it mean to you to have an inclusive climate movement and not leaving anyone behind? So for me, I think of back home for me, which is Houston, Texas. I think of the oil and gas communities that supported schools, scholarships, lifelines for people. And, a lot of times we want to say like, oh, we want to get rid of these people. And I think you've been on that end of that discussion as well. What does inclusivity mean to you?
Yeah, I think it means really welcoming them and recognizing some of their gifts and abilities. I was in Utah recently, and there was a gal who sheepishly admitted that her husband works for Rio Tinto. Thankfully, I was with some other people who immediately surrounded her with support, saying, no, don't worry about that. We actually need a lot more copper if we're going to electrify the fleet. The electric car doesn't come in your driveway by the Easter Bunny. Somebody has to go get some copper in order to make that thing work. And so it's that sort of thing of saying, listen, we need Rio Tinto. Now, we would like it if while they're getting out the copper, could they keep the stuff out of the stream so it doesn't kill the salmon and kill the other fish and various things, and basically do it in better and cleaner ways than we've done in the past, perhaps. But to basically honor them and to say, no, we need you. We're not trying to get rid of you, because that getting rid of thing, what that means is that people really do double down, and they think it's a war to the finish, a fight to the finish, and that gets pretty bloody.
Yeah, so in our last minutes, thanks, Bob. Before we go to questions, I want to ask takeaways for the community. How do you communicate with people who disagree, and action items for us to work on in building more inclusive conversations?
Yeah, I think the next action item is maybe to realize where we are, right? Because I can understand why this, and frankly, I share the frustration with my own party. RepublicEN.org is an obvious intentional misspelling of Republican. And I can understand why people are frustrated. And I share that frustration. But I think what may help us as we reach out to fellow conservatives is understanding it's like this. This is a state of play in my party. There's a guy who wants to eke out one more victory, just one. He's got a very short time horizon. Then there's all these other people, Kevin McCarthy, other legislators, who have a longer time horizon. They hope to get it reelected in 24, 26, 28, 30, 32, you know. Kevin maybe wants to stay speaker long enough to die and have a building named for him or something. That's what speakers do. And so the reality is they see, because they have a longer time horizon, they see the demographic data, they see the polling data, they see that young conservatives want action on climate change as much as young progressives do. But they're scared of this guy. And so that's the challenge right now, is in my party, it's this guy making these people afraid. And so it's somehow we've got to get through that period of time and then have some hope that the long-term view will take over. And there'll be a realization that we're in this together, and really we got to solve this together.
All right, with that, we will turn to audience questions. So Bob, I know you can't see them, but they look very intrigued right now. So okay. We will be having the mic run around. All right, first question. If you would please introduce yourself,
sure.
Where you're from, and then questions.
Okay, hi, I'm Orr. I'm a first-year student at Rutgers University. I wanted to ask, so when I think of Republicans, one of the most baseline statements is fear of regulation, of governmental overreach. It's a lot of belief in market powers and in things balancing themselves out. And so when you're talking to constituents on the ground, how do you convince the average person that the government needs to act and to make changes, because this problem won't necessarily only be solved by a free market?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so we maybe pursue an oxymoron. We think that it's accountable free enterprise, and maybe that's in conflict with the free part, but I don't think so. I think what we say to those conservatives is, don't you believe in accountability? Isn't it sort of the bedrock of conservatism? You know, as conservatives, particularly conservatives of faith, we really believe that accountability brings blessings. Lack of accountability results in havoc. Climate change is that havoc. And so you bring accountability through, we think, a pricing mechanism where you do a carbon tax. Since we're conservatives, we want to cut taxes somewhere else. I'd suggest the payroll tax, because that deals with the regressivity of a carbon tax. And we think that we can get through to them, to actual conservatives. You know, on our website at republican.org, got a great clip of Milton Friedman on the Phil Donahue show in the 1980s. What do you do about pollution then, Dr. Friedman, if you don't want to regulate it? Friedman says, you tax it. You tax pollution. That's rock solid conservatism. And so you don't let people get away with dumping into the trash dump of the sky without accountability. Now, you can try to regulate that, but like I said earlier, you can't regulate Chinese emissions from here in America. And if manufacturers pick up and move from here to there, so they don't have to deal with our regulations, you just went downhill in solving climate change. So what if we look again then at that pricing, that taxing solution? And as long as it's paired with a reduction in other taxes, you can see how a conservative like Art Laffer on our website would say something like, he says, I'm agnostic about climate change. In a 2-minute little clip on our website, he says he's agnostic about climate change. He doesn't know what's real or not. But he says, I don't really need to know. All I need to know is you're taxing income. Tax anything else.
Bob, I hate to cut you off here, but we think
there's a way to get to fellow conservatives on that.
We are just about up on time. I think we have time for one quick question left. If you could just make the question super short, introduce yourself. I don't know where you are, but Paul.
Hello. My name is Paul Leone. I am a sophomore at GW studying environmental science. I consider myself an independent, but of course, more and more I'm seeing people of all sides of the ideological spectrum coming into the center on that foundational scientific issue that climate change is occurring, and we can all agree on those foundational facts. But I still see a lot of divide on the timescale issue with conveying the urgency of the issue as to whether climate change is a distance problem or something that we need to actively start tackling in the present moment. So I'm wondering, how do we bridge that ideological divide between conservatives or progressives on the issue of the timescale and needing to address it with urgency?
I think it's a great observation. Really, it is true that's what it feels like, right? Is that progressives are aware of the urgency of the matter, and it is troubling to have people say, "Well, we'll get to it by and by." That's at Republican.org. We're not content with by and by. In fact, the scientists are sort of constantly ringing in my ears, saying, "Faster, Inglis, faster! We can't wait for that demographic change you were talking about earlier. We got to get going on this." And so that's why we're hopeful, as I said earlier, about the European Union and their helpful momentum making for us in this, because I think that the light bulbs will start going off. And it's particularly wonderful for us at Republican.org that they are talking about this very effective pricing solution. And by the way, you know, I'm banging on here about Milton Friedman and Art Laffer, and everything's red on our site, you know. But if you're progressive and this pricing solution sounds familiar, it may be because it's the same thing that Al Gore has been for about 30 years. I asked him a couple years ago if I could keep on saying that. He said, "Well, hold up, Bob. If you're talking a low," I said, "No, sir, we're talking a substantial carbon tax that's steadily rising." He said, "Yeah, fine then. You can tell people that what you're for at Republican.org is what I've been for about 30 years. And so I have some hope that actually we can bring America together and lead the world to solutions. But you are right. We need to do it quickly.
All right, Bob, thank you so much for joining us. Speaking of bridging divides, I will be allowing people to bridge their way over to, I believe, a break next. So, more programming. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.